Hello everyone, welcome to Frightful Whispers. I'm here to guide you into the shadows tonight. I know you're using this video to unwind and drift off to sleep. So, before we begin, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Where are you watching from? And what time is it for you? Now, get cozy, relax, and let the whispers of the night take over. I'll never forget the day we moved in, when everything felt perfect. You know, that kind of day where the air smells like new beginnings and the world seems to be holding its breath for you. It was the kind of day where you think, this is it. This is where everything changes. My husband, Brian, and I had been dreaming of this moment for so long. We were young, full of hope, and ready to start our family. We'd spent years bouncing between tiny apartments, always searching for something more, something real. And when we found this house, it felt like fate. It stood there at the end of a winding road, hidden in the embrace of towering trees. There was something about it. The old stone walls, the ivy crawling up the sides like it had always belonged. It felt like the house had been waiting for us. "I think this is it," I said, squeezing Brian's hand as we pulled up to the driveway. Brian looked over at me, a grin spreading across his face. "It's perfect." It was perfect. Or at least, it looked like it. We stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching underfoot, and took in our new home. The porch was wide and inviting, creaking gently in the breeze. The kind of house that whispers secrets if you listen close enough. The trees around it swayed lazily, casting shadows that seemed to dance in the setting sun. It was a picture of peace. So much peace, I almost forgot that nothing in life ever stays that way. Inside, the air was thick with dust, the scent of age and neglect. I was too caught up in the excitement to notice at first. The high ceilings, the cold draft, the way the floors creaked under our feet. It all felt alive, like the house had stories to tell, and we were about to write the next chapter. Brian was already pacing around, eyes wide with excitement. "Look at this place, Laura. It's everything we wanted. We can make this a home, a real home." I smiled. He was right. There was so much potential here. The house might have been old, but it was ours. And it wasn't just any house, it was the kind of place where you could picture children running through the halls, where memories would be made in every room. I was lost in the fantasy of it all when I saw it. A small detail, something that didn't make sense at first. A floorboard, slightly askew, almost hidden in the corner of the living room. I knelt down, curious, and ran my fingers over it. That's when I felt it. The faint carving in the wood, like it had been scratched there by someone's hand. I leaned in closer, and there, barely visible, were the words, "Leave now, or join us." My heart stopped. I remember staring at it for a long moment, not sure if I'd imagined it or if the house was already starting to play tricks on me. But then Brian bent down beside me, brushing his hand across the floorboard. "What's this?" he muttered. His voice was thick with confusion. "It looks like it was carved by hand." Strange. At the time, I tried to laugh it off. "It's probably nothing, just an old house thing, right?" Brian nodded, but there was something in his eyes. Something I couldn't place. A flicker of unease. We moved on, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. Something was already aware of us. We spent the next few hours exploring, laughing as we wandered from room to room, imagining how we'd arrange the furniture, where we'd put the crib. The house felt like it was embracing us, opening up in ways I hadn't expected. And yet, with every creak of the floorboards, I began to feel something, an unshakable weight pressing down on me. I remember walking through the upstairs hallway, peering into each bedroom, when a sudden chill swept through the air. It wasn't the cool draft of an old house. No, this was something other. It was the kind of cold that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. And then the whisper came. At first, I thought I was imagining it. A faint voice, a child's voice, distant and soft. I couldn't make out the words, but there was something unmistakable in the tone, like it was calling to me, beckoning me closer. I spun around looking for Brian. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. He was a few steps behind, inspecting the wall with mild curiosity. He didn't seem to hear anything. "Hear what?" he asked, turning toward me with a quizzical look. I swear I heard a voice, a child's voice." Brian shook his head, dismissing it as nothing. "It's probably just the wind. This place is old. Things creak and groan all the time." But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It was subtle at first, just a feeling that prickled at the edges of my mind. But as the night wore on, it became harder to ignore. The house seemed to grow colder, the air heavier, the shadows stretching longer. Later that evening, after we'd settled in, the noises started. At first, it was nothing more than a low, almost imperceptible sound beneath the floorboards. A faint scratching, like nails running across wood. I tried to tell myself it was just the house settling, but the noise grew louder, more persistent, as though something was scratching to get out. I lay awake, listening to the sounds coming from beneath the floor. My heart raced with every passing minute. Brian snored softly beside me, blissfully unaware of the growing dread that consumed me. I couldn't tear my eyes from the shadows in the corners of the room. The house wasn't settling. It was alive. And then I heard it again. "You're not alone." I froze. It was the same child's voice. Clearer now, as if it was standing just behind me. My skin crawled. I tried to shake it off, but the fear was spreading like wildfire inside me. I wanted to wake Brian, to demand that we leave, but I couldn't move. The air was too thick, too suffocating. That night, sleep never came. And when morning finally arrived, I felt no relief. I just felt unsettled. Like we had walked into something we couldn't escape. The house that had seemed so inviting just a day ago now felt like a trap. And I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched by something old and hungry. The house had made its presence known, and it wasn't going to let us go that easily. We had only just begun to live here, and already the house had started to claim us. I remember the first night we moved in. The excitement was still fresh, the thrill of starting something new, something that would change everything. Brian and I had been looking for our perfect home for years, and when we found it, this old house on the edge of town, we just knew it was meant to be ours. It wasn't perfect by anyone else's standards, but it was exactly what we'd been dreaming of. A little worn around the edges, yes, but full of character. The kind of house that felt like it had a story to tell, just waiting for us to live it. It was a quiet evening when we arrived, the kind where the air is crisp and clear, and the world seems to stop just for a moment to let you breathe it all in. The house stood before us, old, charming, with ivy creeping up the sides of the stone walls. The trees surrounding it were tall and imposing, casting long shadows that seemed to reach for the porch as we walked toward the front door. It had a welcoming feel, almost as though it had been waiting for us. Brian held my hand, squeezing it gently as we stepped over the threshold. "This is it," he said, his voice low, but filled with the kind of awe that makes everything feel possible. "This is home." I smiled and nodded, feeling the weight of that word settling around me like a warm blanket. Home. But as we moved through the house, unpacking, making the place our own, I couldn't shake this feeling. A nagging sense that something was off. It was subtle at first. The creaks in the floorboards, the drafts that whispered through the walls, making the air feel colder than it should. The way the windows rattled ever so slightly in their frames, as though the house itself was breathing. But I didn't let it bother me. The house was old, after all. That's what old houses do, right? They creak and groan, they settle. We tried to put it out of our minds, focusing on the excitement of our new beginning. But that night, things started to change. I couldn't sleep. The floorboards beneath us, soft at first, began to groan, and then the sounds grew louder. They weren't the usual settling noises. No, this was something else. A soft scratching like fingernails against wood, echoing from beneath the floor. I sat up in bed, heart racing, the silence around me broken only by the strange rhythm of the sound. It wasn't just a creak or a groan. It was deliberate, almost alive. I turned to Brian, his face relaxed in sleep, unaware. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I was just imagining things, but the sound came again. This time, it was louder, sharper, like claws scraping across the surface. My breath caught in my throat. "Brian," I whispered, shaking him gently, "did you hear that?" He stirred, but didn't wake. Just a low murmur, like he was lost in a dream. "It's nothing, Laura, probably just the house settling," he mumbled, still half asleep. I wanted to believe him. I tried to. But as I lay back down, my eyes wide open in the dark, I felt it. A presence. Something watching us. The sound grew louder, more frantic, as if it was clawing its way through the floor, desperate to reach us. I pulled the blankets tightly around me, willing myself to fall asleep, but it was impossible. The darkness seemed to press in on me from all sides, thick and suffocating. And then, I heard it. A whisper. Soft, distant, but unmistakable. "You're not alone." I froze. My heart stopped. The voice, it was so clear, so real. A child's voice, so quiet but so sharp in the silence. I turned toward Brian again, my skin crawling, but he was still asleep, oblivious to everything. My pulse pounded in my ears. The whisper had come from somewhere inside the room, from somewhere close. What was that? I lay there, my eyes wide, staring into the darkness, but nothing came. The sound of scratching continued, though now it felt like it was moving, shifting. It wasn't just beneath the floor anymore, it was in the walls. It was all around us. I wanted to scream, to wake Brian, but I was paralyzed. Something told me not to. Something told me that if I made a sound, whatever was in this house would hear it, and it would want me to make a sound. I didn't sleep that night. The house, though still and silent on the surface, felt like it was holding its breath, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was waiting for us, watching us. Morning came, and I tried to put it all out of my mind. We had a busy day ahead, moving in the last of our things, getting everything just right. But the house, it wasn't done with us yet. By the time we finished, the sun was dipping below the trees, and the shadows in the house seemed to stretch longer, deeper, as if the walls themselves were closing in. The air felt heavy, thicker somehow. Even with the windows wide open, the house felt off. I didn't say anything to Brian, but I could feel his tension too. Something was gnawing at him, though he tried to hide it behind his smiles and reassurances. That night, we settled on the couch. We laughed, drank wine, tried to enjoy the first night in our new home, but all I could hear was the silence, the eerie, suffocating silence of the house. I tried to ignore it. I tried to tell myself I was being silly. But then the scratching began again. This time it was louder, faster, more insistent. It wasn't just random creaks in the floor, it was rhythmic, A deliberate scraping, like nails across wood, sharp and jagged, as though someone was trying to carve their way out of the very foundation of the house. "Brian, please," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Do you hear that?" He froze. For a moment, I thought he hadn't heard me, but then he slowly turned to look at me, his face pale. "I don't know," he whispered back, his voice hoarse. "I don't know what that is." His words hung in the air, thick with disbelief. His hand gripped mine, his eyes scanning the dark corners of the room. The scratching grew louder, more desperate, and then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was worse, far worse. It felt like something was waiting for us, just behind the walls. The air was heavy with anticipation, thick with a presence that seemed to fill every inch of the room. My breath quickened, and every shadow felt like a pair of eyes staring back at me. "Something's wrong," I muttered. "I don't know what it is, but this house, it's not right." Brian didn't answer. He didn't need to, he could feel it too. The house wasn't just old, it wasn't just settling, it was alive. And it was watching us. That night, I didn't sleep. The whispers came again, this time louder, more persistent. But I wasn't the only one who heard them. Brian sat up in bed, his face pale, eyes wide with terror. He reached for my hand, but the moment our fingers touched, the temperature in the room dropped. A cold, clammy chill crawled across my skin. I wanted to scream, to run, but something stopped me. The house, it was calling to us, and I knew, deep down, that we had already walked too far to turn back. I'll never forget the first time we stepped foot inside that house. It was supposed to be the beginning of something new, a fresh start. My husband, Brian, and I had spent years dreaming of a place to call our own, somewhere to build our lives, to grow our family. And when we found that house, it felt like fate had finally smiled upon us. It was everything we wanted. Quiet, tucked away from the bustle of the world, filled with the kind of character you can't buy, only inherit. The moment we pulled up to the driveway, I felt a strange sense of belonging. The house stood before us, old and a little worn, but it felt like home. The ivy climbing up the sides of the stone walls, the tall trees that whispered in the wind. It was like stepping into a story. It was perfect. "Do you feel it, Brian?" I asked, my voice a little breathless with excitement. He smiled, his eyes glinting. "Yeah, it's everything we imagined." But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. The air around the house felt thick, heavy, as though the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I brushed it off. It was nothing. The house was just old, that's all. I told myself it was just the excitement making me nervous. The house was perfect. We moved in, unpacked, and started making it our own. Everything felt right at first. So right that it almost seemed too good to be true. But by the time the sun set on our first night, something had already begun to stir. I didn't know what it was at first, just an unsettling feeling in the air. It was like the house was alive, breathing, watching. Later that night, as Brian and I lay in bed, trying to fall asleep, I heard it. A soft, faint scratching sound beneath the floorboards. It was so quiet at first that I thought it might have been my imagination, but as I strained to listen, it grew louder. Scratch, scrape, scratch, scrape. It wasn't just the house settling. This was something different, something deliberate. I turned to Brian, shaking him awake. "Brian, do you hear that?" He groaned, half asleep. "It's nothing, Laura. It's probably just the house settling." But I knew it wasn't. This wasn't just an old house creaking under its own weight. This was something else. Something that didn't belong. I listened, straining to hear over the sound of my heartbeat, but it was gone. Just like that. I told myself it was nothing, that I was just tired, that the house was just old. But as the night dragged on, sleep refused to come. The house felt heavier, as though it was closing in on us. The shadows in the corners seemed to stretch and shift, and the silence was thick with something I couldn't name. "You're not alone." I heard it. A whisper, so soft that I almost didn't believe it. But it came again, clear as day. A child's voice calling out to me from somewhere in the dark. I froze. My blood ran cold. Was I dreaming? Or was the house really talking to me? I turned to Brian, but he was still asleep, oblivious to everything. My pulse was racing as I tried to calm myself down, to reason with the fear that was building inside me. But something told me I wasn't imagining it. Something was here, watching us. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I couldn't sleep. The whispering, the scratching, the feeling that the house was alive. It stayed with me long after the sun rose. I tried to push it out of my mind, to focus on the excitement of being in our new home, but the fear kept creeping back. It wasn't just in my head. It was real. The next morning, I tried to act normal. We unpacked some more, organized things, and tried to enjoy the day. But I couldn't ignore the feeling that the house was alive, that it was somehow aware of us, watching us. I wasn't the only one who felt it either. Every so often, Brian would glance at the windows or the shadows in the corners of the rooms, as if he too could sense something lurking just out of sight. That evening, after dinner, we sat together on the couch, trying to shake off the growing unease. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows. It was an old house and it creaked and groaned, but tonight the noises were different. Louder, faster. The scratching came again, but this time it wasn't just beneath the floor, it was everywhere. The walls seemed to be breathing. The sound was like nails scraping against the wood, relentless and maddening. I jumped to my feet. "Brian, listen, it's happening again. Do you hear it?" He looked at me with concern, his face pale. He must have heard it too. But before he could say anything, the scratching stopped, abruptly. The silence that followed was worse than the sound itself. I felt like I was suffocating. My skin prickled with fear. The house was alive. I could feel it in the air, in the way the shadows moved, in the way the temperature dropped. It was no longer a house. It was something else. Something old, something angry. Brian didn't know what to make of it. He said it was just the house settling. Again. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it, something deeper, something darker. That night I couldn't sleep again. I lay there, staring into the dark, listening to the silence, trying to block out the whispers that swirled just at the edge of my consciousness. "You're not alone." It came again, closer this time. "You're not alone, Laura." And then, in the middle of the night, there was a knock on the door. Soft, almost imperceptible, but there. My heart raced as I pulled myself out of bed, trying to shake the terror creeping over me. I walked to the door, my hand trembling as I turned the knob. Standing on the porch was a boy, no older than 10, his clothes ragged and worn, his eyes wide with a strange emptiness. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice shaking. He looked at me, his gaze distant, as though he was seeing something I couldn't. "You shouldn't be here," he said softly, almost apologetically. "The house, it won't let you leave." Before I could ask him anything else, he vanished into the shadows, leaving me standing there, heart pounding in my chest. The night felt colder now, the wind colder than before. The house had noticed us. It was aware of our presence and it didn't want us here. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching us. And that was when I realized we weren't alone. The next morning, I went to town to find some answers. I didn't know what I was expecting, but I needed to know. I needed to understand what was happening. I went straight to the local library, hoping to find something, anything about the house. That's when I met Mr. Ackerman, the town historian. His eyes seemed to see right through me when I asked about the Hanley house, and his expression darkened almost immediately. "The Hanleys," he started, his voice low. "They were the first family to live there, but they vanished. No trace, just gone. The house didn't just stand there, it took them." My stomach twisted as Mr. Ackerman leaned in, his voice barely a whisper. "The house isn't just old," he said. "It's cursed. The Hanleys performed an ancient ritual, something dark, and when it backfired, it bound their souls to the house. They're still there, trapped beneath the floorboards, and now it wants you too." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. The house wasn't just haunted, it was alive, and it had always been waiting for someone like us. We were never meant to stay, but we had. And now, there was no turning back. The house was hungry, and we were its next meal. I thought it was the start of something beautiful. My husband Brian and I had searched for years for a place to call our own, and when we finally found it, this old, secluded house, it felt like everything had fallen into place. It was perfect. A dream, really. Quiet, tucked away from the city noise and full of history. It had a charm that no modern house could match. I remember the first time we pulled up to the house. The air was crisp, the sun hanging low in the sky, casting long shadows over the stone facade. It felt like the house was waiting for us, like it had been sitting there, empty for years, just waiting for someone to fill it with life again. As Brian grabbed our bags and we stepped out of the car, I felt a sense of belonging, a deep, unshakable connection to the place. "This is it," Brian said, his voice full of awe. "It's perfect." I smiled, squeezing his hand, and nodded. "It is." But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something was off. I pushed it aside. It was just nerves, right? Just the excitement of moving into a new home. What could go wrong? We settled in quickly, unpacking and getting things organized. We spent the first few days basking in the joy of having our own place. The walls, the floors, the creaking of the old beams. It was all so comforting. But then, the noises started. Little things at first. A creak in the floor, a tap on the wall. I thought it was just the house settling. But when the sounds grew louder, I started to wonder. It was almost as if the house was trying to get my attention. Scratching. A steady, rhythmic scraping, like nails running across wood, coming from beneath the floor. I tried to ignore it. It had to be nothing. Old houses made noises, right? The wind, the pipes, the foundation settling. But then one night, the scratching became something else. Something deliberate. It wasn't just under the floor anymore. It felt like it was everywhere, moving through the walls, pressing in on us. I turned to Brian, my heart racing. "Do you hear that?" He looked at me, clearly startled. "Hear what?" "The scratching. It's coming from under the floorboards." Brian shook his head, trying to dismiss it. "It's just the house, Laura. Old wood creaks, the pipes." But it wasn't. I knew it wasn't. I'd grown up in old houses. This wasn't a normal noise. This was something different. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay there, wide awake, staring into the darkness, listening to the scratching that seemed to grow louder with each passing minute. Then, amidst the noise, I heard something else. A whisper. A soft, childlike voice, so faint I almost didn't believe it. You're not alone." My blood ran cold. I froze, straining to hear. The voice, it sounded so close. It was as though it was right behind me, just out of reach. But when I turned to Brian, still fast asleep beside me, I knew he hadn't heard it. I had to be imagining it. But then, the scratching came again, louder this time, urgent. I lay there, paralyzed with fear. What was happening to me? Why was I hearing things? The next morning, I tried to push it all out of my mind. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe it was just the stress of moving, the excitement of starting fresh. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. And it wasn't just the sounds, the house. It felt like it was alive, watching us, waiting for us to slip up. By the time the second night rolled around, I was a nervous wreck. The air in the house had shifted somehow, thicker, heavier, like it was pressing down on me. The whispers were still there, faint but constant, and I couldn't escape the feeling that someone, something, was watching us from the shadows. It started again, the scratching. But this time, it wasn't just under the floor, it was everywhere, in the walls, in the ceiling. It was all around us, moving, pacing, like something was trapped inside the house, clawing its way out. I could hear it, feel it, shaking the walls, rattling the windows. "Brian," I whispered, "do you hear it this time?" He didn't respond. His face was twisted in a tight frown, like he was still asleep. But I knew he wasn't. His body was stiff, his breathing shallow. It was like he felt it too. He turned to me, his eyes wide with fear. "What the hell is that?" he asked. "I don't know," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "But it's not just the house." And then the air turned cold, freezing. I pulled the blanket tighter around me, shivering, but the cold didn't stop. It spread, creeping over my skin like icy fingers. I looked around the room, trying to find the source of the chill, but the house was empty. That's when it came again. The whisper. Louder now, closer. "You're not alone." I shot up in bed, heart pounding, gasping for air. The room was suffocating. The walls seemed to be pressing in on me. I couldn't breathe. The whispers were all around me, filling the space, swirling in the air. "You're not alone. You're not alone." I looked to Brian, desperate to make sense of it, but he was gone. He wasn't in the bed. The blankets were thrown off, the pillow twisted. I turned, my breath caught in my throat. He wasn't anywhere in the room. And then I heard it, the sound of footsteps. Thud, thud, thud. They came from below, from the floor. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know where to go. My feet felt like lead, but somehow I managed to make my way to the door. I yanked it open, but the moment I stepped into the hallway, I stopped dead in my tracks. There, at the end of the corridor, was a figure. A child. His face pale, eyes dark and hollow. His clothes were ragged, torn, like they had been worn for years. He looked at me with those dark eyes, his face expressionless. "You shouldn't be here," he said softly, almost apologetically. "They're waiting for you." I opened my mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. The floor beneath me groaned, and I realized with a sickening certainty that the house itself had shifted. The walls were closing in. The whispers were growing louder, frantic. Before I could move, the child was gone, vanishing into thin air, leaving only the echo of his words behind. I ran. I had to get out. I had to leave. I didn't care if I was losing my mind. I had to escape. But when I reached the door, I couldn't open it. It was locked. I tried again and again, my hands trembling, but the door wouldn't budge. The scratching beneath the floor had turned into a pounding. The house was shaking now. The walls groaned. The air was suffocating, thick with something dark and oppressive. And that's when it hit me. The realization, the truth. We were trapped. We weren't alone. and we never would be again. The house had claimed us, and it was never letting us go, leave, or join us. The whispers came again, louder this time, filling the house, crawling into my skin. But there was nowhere to go. We were already part of it. And the house, it was hungry. Thank you for venturing into the shadows with me here at Frightful Whispers. Remember, the darkness holds secrets, but also whispers truths to those who dare to listen. If tonight's tale sent shivers down your spine, be sure to like, share, and subscribe. It helps keep the fire of fright alive. Rest easy, but keep one eye open, for the night is never truly still. Until we meet again, stay vigilant, stay curious, and let the whispers guide you.